What's up with witches and their jars? You really want to know? All right, sit down. This is going to take a minute. First, a bit of housekeeping. This turned into a bit of a rabbit hole, and I ran out of time to work on the actual video itself. So, no fancy stuff popping up on screen or music. If you want to listen to it more like a podcast this time, you won't miss anything. This is going to be part one. Part two is in the works. Right. Witches and their jars. Nowadays, we call them jars. I'm still trying to dig into when the term switch happened, but I'm thinking it was probably when mason jars became easier to get than glass bottles. Historically, what we're looking at are called witches' bottles. And they weren't used by witches, they were used against them. What were they? Well, they were bottles or jugs filled with interesting things. Items like iron nails, pens, sometimes broken glass or pottery, and another common ingredient was urine. The intent behind them? To trap the witch that had afflicted the victim. In digging, I found that the nails or pens were often bent. This seems to have been done to sort of kill them in this world and move them to the other world. The other world being where they thought the witches traveled. As for the urine, turns out urinary problems were very common in the 16th and 17th centuries. It looks like this was an ingredient meant to transfer the pain from the victim back to the witch. Red thread from sprite traps and vinegar were also somewhat common ingredients. Often, these bottles, once made, were buried on the property, sometimes the far corner of the property, sometimes under the hearth or the doorway to the house. Other times, they were embedded in the wall of the house. Another thing that's interesting to note is that these were used both as preemptive measures and on an as needed basis. Finds have been made that indicate bottles placed during construction of a house as a protection ward, and finds that indicate holes made post construction as a remedy. When did this type of practice begin? Well, that's a bit hard to tell. The oldest find thus far has been in the East Anglia region of England. It dates to the early 16th century, though there are practices that predate the witch bottle. Things like spiritual middens and just the practice of burying things under a house during construction were common before the witch's bottle. Most sources agree that the bottle version began in the 16th century. They disagree, however, on when or if this practice has fallen out of practice in popular folk magic. In Great Britain, they found about 200 witches' bottles, including a very rare find of one fully intact with stopper and contents. Of note about this fully intact find, they've been able to run tests that found the person who made the bottle was a smoker. There was nicotine in the urine. And by looking at the nail clippings and finding little wear to the nails, have come to the conclusion this person was of some social standing. If that is the case, then it would point to this not being a practice of just the common people back then, but one that was more ubiquitous. Why were they made? Well, typically, the victim would make a bottle when they felt afflicted by something. So it would put it in the medicinal category back then. Though, as I mentioned, some were made before the person was sick in what looks to be an effort to protect their home. Either way, these were made to protect the person from witches. That being the case, it was the average person that was making these bottles back then, not witches. When we look at examples that have been found, we see that where Great Britain has about 200 finds, North America has under a dozen. Of those in North America, two have dated to the Civil War. This, I think, is why sources disagree on when or if it has fallen out of practice. Though I think it's safe to say it hasn't actually fallen out of practice. More on that in part two. When looking at finds from both sides of the Atlantic and over the 200 years that the practice can be seen archaeologically, we find that the ingredients haven't changed. Testing of the Civil War era finds indicate urine was likely used, though the bottles were broken, so it's impossible to say for certain. They also include pens and nails. Of note from one Civil War find is that it was found in the officers' area of the fort, buried by the hearth. This seems to be seen by sources as indicating that again, it wasn't just the common people that used them. Those with some standing used them as well. What I've found really intriguing is that some of the finds in Great Britain included pens stuck into pieces of felt in the same shape as we see in the hex signs found on barns in Pennsylvania. Though we can't say from an archaeological standpoint, it would be interesting to know if these two practices were linked in some way. In all of this, I did run across something that was pretty entertaining. There was this cardinal, Robert Bellarmino. He was known for being particularly nasty to Protestants. Well, turns out Protestant Germany happened to make these jugs that got the name Bellarmines due to having a bearded face embossed on them. From the excavations and finds in England, it would seem that Bellarmine jugs were not only the jug of choice for drinking, but also for making witches' bottles. Okay, I think that's going to be it for this vid. In part two, we'll look at contemporary witches' bottles, what's in them, and how they're used now. There'll be a bunch of links in the description for the sources I used. Give them a look, but beware the rabbit hole. Smack the like button, kick the sub button, or toss the bell in a jar. Thanks so much for watching. Now, help or get out of the way.